So yoga teachers sometimes say crazy things or cues that may be a little bit bewildering, such as the cue to draw your front ribs in, or soften your front ribs, or broaden through your kidneys, or widen your upper back. What exactly does that mean, and what is going on anatomically? Well, in this video, we're going to take a look at those cues and break them down so you know exactly what's going on those cues. And if you're using those cues as teachers, know exactly what you're asking your students to do. Okay, so let's look at these cues. Soften your front ribs in, broaden your upper back, puff up through your kidneys. You guys might have heard those before. So what are your yoga teachers saying? What do they mean? Well, one of the reasons why these cues can be a little confusing is because we're actually asking the body to do two different things. So we're asking the body to move the spine, which is of course the central axis of our body, which runs from our skull all the way down to our tailbone. So we're asking the body to do something with the spine, and we're also asking the body to do something with the shoulder girdle, specifically with what we might call the scapulothoracic joint, which is where my shoulder blades slide on the back. So to fully understand these cues, let's first look at those two movements individually. A great way to feel the difference between these two movements is in a familiar yoga pose that we might do called cat and cow. So go ahead, come onto your hands and your knees with me. Place your hands outer shoulder distance apart, knees underneath your hips, and we'll just do a regular cat-cow. So start by tipping your tailbone up, dropping the belly, which draws in the lumbar spine, pulling your chest forward, which starts to bring you into spinal extension or a back bend, right? And then tailbone down and round your spine. And just do that a few times so you can feel as you do this action that we're really asking the spine to move, right? We're moving that whole axis of our body in a wave. So now we've got that movement. So that's part of the equation. Now let's go to the other part of the equation, which is the movement of the scapula, the shoulder blades on your back. So go ahead and come onto your hands and to your knees again. Now this time we're not going to move the spine. So instead, just drop your chest, pull your shoulder blades together, and then spread them apart. So drop your chest, pull your shoulder blades together, and then push the floor away and spread them apart. Now careful not to bend your elbows and careful not to move your spine. See if you can keep your spine really steady. So the only thing that's moving are these shoulder blades that are sliding on your back. And these movements of the shoulder blade are called retraction, when we retract and squeeze them together, and protraction, which is when we spread them apart. So in our little scapular push-ups, we're doing retraction and protraction. And this movement is a really important component of finding scapular stability in our upper back. So what the heck is going on when we're drawing our front ribs in or we're, broadening our upper back? Well, generally speaking, we're actually doing both of those actions that we just explored. So let's take a look at this. So when we're drawing our front ribs in, usually that is because we might be standing in a little bit of spinal extension. So drawing the front ribs in is a way of ironing out the spine, right? And taking the back bend out of the thoracic spine and maybe even a little bit of the lumbar spine. So when we draw the front ribs in, we're moving from a position generally of a little bit of extension through our spine or back bending through our spine to more neutral through the spine. So that's usually involving kind of ironing out the lumbar spine. Drawing in the front ribs will usually move the thoracic back. So that's part one of that cue. But also, what teachers often mean is to protract the shoulder blades a little bit. That is to draw them apart. So if I'm puffing through my kidneys, which are here, right? I'm often asking students to slightly widen the upper back by pulling the shoulder blades apart. Now, here's the reason this is sort of tricky, is because when we move our bodies, oftentimes we don't have kind of the mind mapping to distinguish the difference between moving the spine and moving the shoulder blades. But as you've seen in the exercise we just did, we can move them separately. So moving the spine doesn't necessarily mean moving the shoulder blades. However, we tend to kind of conflate those movements together. So just try this with me. Come and stand and squeeze your shoulder blades together behind you. And you'll notice that you probably also stuck your chest out, right? Which is part of this spinal extension. But just try it with me without doing that. So keep your ribs soft, stand in your Tadasana, and then notice that you can actually protract your shoulders. You can draw your shoulder blades apart and squeeze them together without moving your spine. Oh, so those two movements often get sticky together. We usually do this, but you can do them separately. Similarly, if I'm standing in Tadasana, it is possible for me to just move my spine without moving my shoulder blades, right? So see if you can try that without sliding the shoulder blades around. See if you can just round your spine and arch your spine, round your spine and arch your spine. And now you'll feel that, usually, typically, when we draw our shoulders back though, we usually just go into spinal extension, and when we pull our shoulder blades apart, we usually round our spine a little bit. So all of that is to say that when you hear your teacher say, soften your front ribs in, they might be asking you because you're in a little bit of a back bend here, right? Or they might be asking you to soften your front ribs in because they want you to protract your shoulder blades. But usually it's a combination of the two. So when we say draw your front ribs in, we're usually talking about taking yourself out of a back bend, moving more to neutral, and also perhaps widening the shoulder blades apart a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about the muscles that are involved in this action. And again, because these are two different movements in our body, we'll consider them one at a time. So let's consider the first move, the movement of the spine, which is when we say soften the ribs in, that we actually are just trying to get people out of being a little back bendy and a little bit more into neutral. So you might hear people say, soften your front ribs in. You might hear them say, knit your ribs in or connect your ribs to your hip points. Sometimes I'll use the image of a little bungee cord. I'll say, imagine you got a bungee cord here on your hip points and on your ribs, and those are pulling in together. And what I'm trying to get my students to do is to not be so back bendy, but to use the front body musculature here to gather and contain the front body in. And this is important, say we're stabilizing to go into a back bend, right? So I don't want students to just collapse in their lumbar, so I might cue them to knit the bottom ribs in so that this stays stable as they start to move into their upper back. So it's a way of containing this part of the back. This part of the spine tends to be super bendy, right about the part where our T12 and L1 meet. So where our thoracic curve goes into our lumbar curve, it tends to be super flexy. And so as a habit, we tend to just fall into that. So drawing your front ribs in is an attempt to stabilize that very mobile part and then move the movement somewhere else, like maybe into your upper back. So the muscles that are involved here are on the front body, right? So if I'm standing here, I'm going to be contracting something on the front of my body in order to contract, shorten this space. So that's going to be, there's a big old muscle called rectus abdominis, which runs down from your ribs all the way to your pubic bone. When we contract this, it helps to gather in. We also have a couple layers of abdominals, the obliques, which wrap around. Now these help in twisting, but they can also help to gather and anchor the sides of the body. So usually this cue of gathering the front ribs in is an engagement of the abdominal wall to some extent, right? So I'm kind of coming out of this spinal extension, so I'm relaxing the muscles of my back a little bit or letting them lengthen and contracting and shortening the muscles, the abdominals on the front of my body. Now, when I'm moving my shoulder blades around, that involves a different set of muscles. So on the back body, there is this beautiful wrapping muscle from underneath the shoulder blades that wraps around to the ribs called serratus anterior. And that pulls the shoulder blade around the side of the body. So that's the muscle we use to broaden our shoulder blades apart here, right? That's the muscle that we're using to spread the shoulder blades or widen the upper back, right? So that's a little different. Like gathering the front of the ribs in is a little bit more about the front of the body, but the shoulder blades moving apart is serratus anterior. What's kind of cool and nerdy, friends, is that serratus anterior kind of interdigitates with some of these abdominal muscles in this beautiful spiraling action that happens, so that when we widen the shoulder blades apart, we actually are starting to pull on this line of musculature that runs through the obliques to contain the core. Oh, it's so exciting. So they can kind of work together in that action, right? Super, super cool. Now, when are these cues often used? Well, as I already mentioned, I use this kind of cue like to gather the front ribs in whenever I'm going into something, which is asking for a back bend. Again, because we're so back bendy right at this junction here, we just love to fall into it. I will tell my students, hey, engage here so as to encourage them to move their back bend into their upper back, which is where we kind of need it more. Another place where you'll often hear this cue is when we reach the arms forward and up. Here's the reason. When we reach our arms forward and up, there's a big old muscle here called the lats, which you may have heard of, latissimus dorsi, which when I reach my arms forward and up, it starts to get stretched. So it runs from my arm to my back. And when I reach my arms forward and it starts to get stretched, it's like, I don't want to stretch. So instead it pulls the upper back in so it can avoid, right? So if I'm stretching and I reach a sticky point and I can't get my arms up any higher, but I'm supposed to take my arms up, well, hey, I'll just compensate in my back. You notice I'm not lifting my arm up anymore, but it looks like they got higher because I took it into my back body. So we'll often hear like knit the front ribs in, because what that's asking us to do is stabilize this area, right? Not let it flare out. And what that makes happen is that this big hunkin' beautiful muscle lat has to stretch. So that's often where we'll get these actions here, is to pull the front ribs in as we're doing something which might otherwise cause them to flare out. I should also mention that where I like to use these cues is in opposition to moving the shoulder blades back and drawing the upper back in. So in other words, I pair the action, pull your front ribs in, with the cue, draw your shoulders back. Because when we cue our students to draw their shoulders back or squeeze their shoulder blades together, remember, it's hard for them to distinguish between just retracting the shoulders and doing a little back bend in the upper back, right? So they're gonna put those two things together. So to create balanced action in the body, if I say draw your front ribs in to your body, right, which is causing usually a little bit of this rounding of the spine, a little bit of spreading of the shoulder blades, I will say do that as you widen your collarbones, draw your shoulders back, because what that action is doing is its opposite. I'm asking my shoulder blades to squeeze together, and I'm actually moving the upper back in. So when we use opposing actions and we ask opposing muscle groups to contract, we create stability and a newfound sense of connection to our body. So just try this with me. Bring your hands onto your front ribs, right? Imagine your little bungee cords here from your hip points to your low ribs, and draw your front ribs in. Okay, so notice that brings your ribs back a little bit, it brings your spine back a little bit, and probably spread your shoulder blades apart just a tiny bit. So keep that. Keep the front ribs gathering into the back body, and now, with that action, also start to draw your shoulders back. And you'll feel that your upper back starts to move in and your shoulder blades start to squeeze together. Which creates a little bit more stability, a little bit more awareness, all the way up here in the shoulder girdle and in the upper body. So there you go, everybody. There is a little breakdown of a somewhat mysterious cue. Draw your front ribs in, or broaden your upper back, or broaden your kidneys. And hopefully in this video, we've helped to clarify a little bit exactly what's going on in the body, which muscles are being used, and what we're actually asking of our students. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like more tips, please subscribe for more information. And I look forward to seeing you on the mat.